In a world where power and legacy rule, a single mother battles against the overwhelming influence of a family determined to control her children's future. Emily Porter's quiet life in Chicago is shattered when her ex-husband, Daniel, resurfaces, bringing with him regrets, secrets, and the shadow of his manipulative mother, Margaret Lexington. As Emily fights to protect her twin boys, alliances form, betrayals surface, and a bitter battle ensues for love, family, and freedom. Will Emily's strength be enough to shield her sons from the Lexington legacy? Or will Margaret's relentless ambition destroy everything Emily has built? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you joining us from? Emily Porter wiped her hands on her apron, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the small cafe. The hum of conversation and clinking ceramic cups was her daily solace. It had been 7 years since she left the grand Lexington estate, a life she once thought would bring her happiness. She glanced toward the window where her twin boys, Jack and Liam, chased each other in the autumn sunlight. Their laughter was the music that kept her going. Her life had settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet joy. But a sharp pang hit her chest every time she noticed their sandy brown hair and sharp cheekbones, features identical to their father, Daniel Lexington. He had walked away without looking back, pushed by his overbearing mother, Margaret, who saw Emily as a stain on their prestigious family name. Outside, the boys shrieked with delight. Emily turned back to the counter just as the cafe door jingled open. She greeted the customer without looking up, her fingers busy with the register. "Just black coffee," came a warm, familiar voice. Emily froze. Her hands tightened on the countertop as her heart raced. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet Daniel's. He looked older, a little worn around the edges, but the unmistakable Lexington confidence still radiated from him. "Emily," he said softly, his voice laced with hesitation. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "What are you doing here?" Daniel shifted awkwardly, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "I'm in town for work and I—" His gaze flicked to the boys outside. His breath caught as his face paled. Emily stepped in front of the window, as if to shield her sons from his view. "You don't get to just show up," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "Are they? They're mine," she snapped, cutting him off. "That's all you need to know." Daniel's face crumpled, guilt evident in his eyes. Before he could speak, the cafe door jingled again, and Andrew, a tall, kind-eyed doctor who had become Emily's anchor, entered. His easy smile vanished as he spotted Daniel. "Is everything okay here?" Andrew asked, stepping closer to Emily. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm their father. I have every right." "You gave up that right the moment you walked away," Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "You don't get to waltz back into their lives just because it's convenient for you." Jack and Liam came bounding inside, oblivious to the tension. "Mom, look what we found." Jack held up a shiny rock, grinning from ear to ear. Emily crouched down, brushing a hand through his hair. "That's amazing, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer now. Daniel watched, his expression a mix of awe and regret. Andrew placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder, grounding her. As Daniel left the cafe, he paused at the door. "I'll be back," he said quietly. "I'm not going to disappear again." Emily's heart clenched as she watched him go. She didn't believe him, but deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. Something about his return, the lingering look in his eyes, felt like a warning of storms yet to come. Margaret Lexington folded the leather-bound file shut with a deliberate snap, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she stared at the investigator standing before her. The man, dressed in a modest suit, fidgeted under her piercing gaze. He had just confirmed what she had long suspected: Daniel had fathered 2 boys. "Twins," she murmured, her voice cold and calculating. Her manicured fingers drummed on the polished mahogany desk. "And their mother, Emily, has managed to raise them without even a whisper to the press. Yes, ma'am, the investigator said, his tone deferential. She's kept a low profile, but the boys, he hesitated. They look just like him. Margaret smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. The legacy she had fought so hard to preserve was now complicated by this revelation. She couldn't afford to let the twins grow up away from the influence of the Lexington name. They were her ticket to solidifying the family's future. But there was a problem, Emily. Margaret dismissed the investigator with a curt nod, then turned her attention to the framed family portrait on the wall. The Lexington name demanded power and tradition. Emily and her sons represented chaos. But chaos could be contained, manipulated, even if handled correctly. The knock on Emily's apartment door was sharp and authoritative, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. Andrew glanced up from the table, where he was helping Jack and Liam with their drawing, his expression immediately cautious. "I'll get it," Emily said, her voice steady despite the unease building in her chest. She opened the door to find Margaret Lexington standing on the threshold, a vision of wealth and precision in her tailored coat. "Emily," Margaret said smoothly, her tone cordial but edged with steel. "May I come in?" Emily stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind her. "We have nothing to discuss," she said, crossing her arms. "Oh, but we do," Margaret replied, her smile tightening. "Those boys of yours, they're Lexingtons. They deserve opportunities you can't possibly provide." Emily's jaw clenched. "They deserve love and stability, not to be pawns in your power games." Margaret's expression hardened. "Don't be naive. The Lexington name opens doors you don't even know exist. What happens when your boys start asking questions? When they realize what they're missing?" Emily stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "What they're missing is a family that abandoned them before they were even born. They're happy, Margaret, and I won't let you take that away from them." The door opened slightly, and Andrew stepped out, his presence solid and reassuring. "She's made herself clear," he said calmly, his voice firm. "You should leave." Margaret's eyes flicked to him, her disdain evident. "And who are you to involve yourself in family matters?" "I'm someone who cares about them," Andrew replied, unflinching. "And someone who won't let you bulldoze over Emily or her sons." Margaret's lips thinned, and for a moment, her composure cracked. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice dripping with icy resolve. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Inside, Emily sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. Andrew sat beside her, his steady hand on her back. "She won't stop," Emily murmured, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "No," Andrew agreed. "But neither will we." In the quiet that followed, Emily looked at her boys, their innocent laughter filling the apartment. Margaret might have power and wealth, but Emily had something far stronger, a mother's love and an unbreakable resolve to protect her family. Daniel sat at the desk in his Chicago hotel room. The investigative report spread before him. The black and white photos of Jack and Liam stared back at him, their grinning faces strikingly familiar. He traced his thumb over the image, his breath catching in his throat. There was no denying it, they were his sons. He leaned back in the chair, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like a stone. 7 years. 7 years he had let them grow up without him, all because he had allowed Margaret to dictate his choices. Her cold ambition had shaped his every decision, but now he saw the price he had paid. A knock at the door startled him. "Come in," Daniel called, straightening up. Margaret stepped inside, her presence commanding as always. She closed the door behind her, surveying the room with a critical eye. "I heard you've been investigating," she said, her voice calm but probing. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I had to know the truth." Margaret's lips curved into a thin smile. "And now you do. Those boys are Lexingtons. They belong with their family. They belong with Emily," Daniel said sharply. "She raised them. She protected them when we didn't." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her tone turning icy. You mean when you didn't? Don't forget, Daniel, it was your weakness that allowed her to walk away. But you can fix this. Bring them into the family where they belong. Offer them a future only we can provide. Daniel stood, his fists clenching. You think I don't see what you're doing? This isn't about them, it's about your obsession with the Lexington name. You don't care about those boys, and you never cared about Emily. All you've ever cared about is control. Margaret's smile faded, replaced by a cold glare. Control is what keeps this family strong. Without it, we fall apart. Daniel's voice dropped, steady but firm. We're already falling apart. And you're the reason why. That afternoon, Daniel found himself wandering through Millennium Park. The laughter of children filled the air, mingling with the rustling of trees and the distant hum of the city. His eyes scanned the playground until they found her Emily, sitting on a bench, watching Jack and Liam race each other across the grass. His heart ached as he watched them, his sons. Their energy, their joy, it was something he hadn't seen in years. But when his gaze shifted to Emily, he saw something else: resilience. She had built a life without him, and it was clear she would do anything to protect it. Summoning his courage, Daniel approached her. She looked up, her smile fading as her expression turned wary. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone guarded. Daniel hesitated, his hands in his pockets. "I wanted to see them, to see you." Emily's eyes hardened. "We don't need you, Daniel." "I know," he said quietly. "But I need them." Emily shook her head, her voice trembling with frustration. "You don't get to show up after 7 years and decide you want to be a father. They're happy. They're safe. And I won't let you take that away." Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze dropping. "I don't want to take anything away. I want a chance to be in their lives, even if it's just as a friend." Emily stared at him, her heart warring with itself. She wanted to tell him to leave, to stay out of their lives. But a small, quiet part of her remembered the man she had once loved, and the boys deserved to know where they came from, even if it was only in fragments. "Fine," she said at last, her voice low. "But on my terms, and the moment I think you're hurting them, you're gone." Daniel nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. Emily turned away, her arms crossing as she watched the boys play. "Don't thank me," she said coldly. "This isn't for you." Emily sat at her small dining table late that night, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional rustle from Jack and Liam's room. Across from her, Andrew leaned forward, his expression filled with concern. "He's back, isn't he?" Andrew asked softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on the swirling tea. "He saw the boys at the park today. He wants to be part of their lives." Andrew leaned back, the tension in his shoulders visible. "And what do you want?" She exhaled shakily, setting the cup down. "I don't know. Part of me wants to slam the door in his face, but," her voice faltered, "they deserve to know their father, even if he was a coward back then." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he remained quiet. His silence wasn't one of judgment, but support, something Emily had grown to appreciate in the years they'd spent together. "Do you trust him?" he asked finally. Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I don't trust his mother. Margaret doesn't care about those boys. She just sees them as pawns to preserve the Lexington name. I won't let her sink her claws into them." Andrew nodded. "Then we make sure she doesn't. You've built a good life for them, Emily. You've been enough." His words were meant to reassure her, but they stirred a painful memory instead. Emily clenched her fists, her chest tightening. "I wasn't always enough," she whispered. Andrew frowned, leaning closer. "What do you mean?" Emily swallowed hard, the words heavy on her tongue. "Before I left the estate, Margaret came to me. She told me I wasn't worthy of the Lexington name, that I couldn't give Daniel what he needed, a family. She gave me an ultimatum." Andrew's expression darkened. "What kind of ultimatum?" Emily's voice cracked as she continued. I was pregnant before Jack and Liam. Margaret found out and told me if I didn't terminate the pregnancy, she would destroy Daniel's career, his reputation. I didn't have a choice, Andrew. Tears welled in her eyes as the memory overwhelmed her. Andrew reached for her hand, his grip steady. You don't have to carry that alone anymore, he said gently. Whatever happened then doesn't define the mother you've become now. The next day, Emily's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let Margaret dictate her life again. She decided it was time to set boundaries, to ensure her boys were protected. At the park, Daniel was already waiting when she arrived with Jack and Liam. He looked nervous, pacing by the swings. The boys dashed toward him, their curiosity overcoming any apprehension. Daniel knelt, his smile tentative but genuine. Hey, guys. I'm a friend of your mom's. Jack tilted his head, his brow furrowing. Why do you look like us? Emily stepped in quickly, her tone light but firm. He's just someone Mom used to know, sweetheart. Now go play. The boys nodded and ran toward the jungle gym, their laughter soon filling the air. Emily crossed her arms and faced Daniel. Listen, she said, her voice low and steady. You get to see them, but you don't get to tell them the truth. Not yet. They're not ready for that. Daniel nodded, guilt evident in his expression. I understand. Thank you for letting me be here. Emily's gaze hardened. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for them. And if Margaret gets involved, she won't. Daniel interrupted, his tone resolute. I'll make sure of it. But Emily wasn't convinced. Margaret had always been relentless, and Emily knew she wouldn't give up so easily. As she watched Daniel play with Jack and Liam from a distance, Emily's heart wavered. She couldn't forget the past, but for her boys' sake, she might have to face it head-on. Margaret Lexington stared out the window of her New York office, her sharp gaze fixed on the city skyline. The investigator's report on Emily and her twins rested on the desk behind her, but it wasn't the photographs or the documentation that occupied her thoughts. It was the cold, undeniable truth. Daniel had defied her wishes, allowing Emily and those boys to remain beyond her reach for 7 years. Now, he was jeopardizing everything by reconnecting with them. Her assistant entered quietly, placing a cup of tea on the desk. Ma'am, your flight to Chicago is confirmed. You'll arrive by tomorrow afternoon. Margaret turned, her lips curling into a faint, calculated smile. Perfect. Have you arranged the meeting with the property developer? Yes, ma'am. They're expecting you to tour potential Lexington holdings in the city. Margaret's smile tightened. The excuse was airtight. No one would suspect her true intentions. The next afternoon, Emily was stacking cups behind the cafe counter when she saw Margaret's reflection in the glass display case. Her body stiffened, and the sound of ceramic against wood echoed louder than she intended. Emily, Margaret said, her voice smooth but ice cold. It's been a long time. Emily turned, slowly, meeting the older woman's piercing gaze. Not long enough, she replied, keeping her voice low but firm. Margaret ignored the jab and stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. I've come to discuss your sons. They're none of your business, Emily said quickly, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Margaret's smile didn't falter. They're Lexington's, Emily. Whether you like it or not, they have a legacy to uphold. A future that only the Lexington name can provide. Emily's jaw tightened. They already have a future, Margaret. One filled with love and stability, not manipulation and power plays. Margaret's eyes glinted dangerously. Do you really think this little life you've built can compete with what I can offer them? Private schools, connections, wealth, the kind of future you could never dream of. Emily stepped around the counter, her voice trembling with restrained fury. What they need is a mother who loves them and a life free of people like you. I won't let you destroy them the way you tried to destroy me. Margaret's expression hardened, and for a moment, she dropped all pretense of civility. You can't stop me, Emily. I've already taken the first steps to secure their future. Daniel will see reason eventually. He always does. Emily's breath caught, but she refused to let Margaret see her fear. You're underestimating me. I won't let you manipulate Daniel or my sons. Stay away from us. Margaret's smile returned, cold and unyielding. We'll see about that. That evening, Daniel arrived at Emily's apartment unannounced. He looked rattled, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. She's here, isn't she? He asked the moment Emily opened the door. Yes, Emily replied curtly, stepping aside to let him in. She came to the cafe today. She wants the boys. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I told her to stay out of this. Emily crossed her arms. Do you really think you can stop her? She's not someone who gives up, Daniel. Daniel sighed, sinking onto the couch. I know, but I'll find a way to keep her from interfering. I owe you that much. Emily studied him for a moment, her defenses wavering. Do you really mean that? Or are you just trying to ease your guilt? Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with remorse. I mean it. I'll fight. For them, for you. I won't let her hurt you again. Later that night, Margaret sat in her hotel suite, a glass of wine in hand as she reviewed a series of legal documents. One in particular caught her eye, a custody petition she planned to file. She hadn't told Daniel yet, but she knew how to manipulate him when the time came. As she sipped her wine, her phone buzzed. It was her assistant, delivering an update on Emily. She's stronger than you think, the assistant said. She's not going to back down easily. Margaret's smile widened. Good, she said. That makes the game more interesting. Daniel's breath fogged in the chilly Chicago air as he stood outside Margaret's hotel. He had spent the night pacing his own room, replaying the tension-filled confrontation with Emily and the subtle, ominous threats from his mother. Now he was done standing by. It was time to confront Margaret directly. Inside the lavish suite, Margaret sat at a polished mahogany desk, reviewing the custody petition she intended to file. When Daniel knocked, she glanced up unsurprised and called for him to enter. Daniel, she greeted smoothly, setting the document aside. I was wondering when you'd come. He stepped in, closing the door firmly behind him. I know what you're planning, and it stops now. Margaret raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. And what exactly am I planning? Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. You're trying to take the boys from Emily. Filing for custody. Manipulating me, it's the same game you always play, Mother. But this time I won't let you win. Margaret leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. I'm not playing games, Daniel. I'm ensuring the Lexington legacy survives. Those boys are Lexingtons, and they deserve everything this family can offer. They deserve a childhood, Daniel snapped. They deserve to grow up with a mother who loves them and protects them, not to be dragged into the mess you've made of this family. Margaret's smirk faded, her eyes narrowing. Don't be naive. You think Emily can provide for them? Give them the opportunities they need to thrive. She leaned forward, her tone sharper now. She's barely scraping by in that tiny apartment. Do you really think that's the life they deserve? Daniel clenched his fists, his anger rising. They're happy, Margaret. Jack and Liam don't need your money or your influence. And Emily, she's done more for them in 7 years than I ever have. That's why I'm standing with her. Margaret's gaze turned icy. You're making a mistake. You'll regret this. No, Daniel said firmly, his voice resolute. My mistake was letting you control me for so long. I'm done being your pawn. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood, her movements slow and deliberate. You think you can defy me and protect them? She said, her voice laced with disdain. You don't have the resolve for that. Daniel, you never have. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Watch me. Daniel left the hotel with a new sense of determination. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for a better future for Emily, for Jack and Liam, and even for himself. He went straight to Emily's apartment. She opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "What now?" she asked, crossing her arms. Daniel hesitated, searching for the right words. "I confronted her," he said simply. "She's planning to file for custody." Emily's face paled, but her voice was steady. "I figured as much." "I'm going to stop her," Daniel continued, his tone firm. "I'll testify. I'll speak to the press, whatever it takes. She doesn't get to ruin your life, or there's any more." Emily studied him, her defenses softening slightly. "You really mean that?" "Yes," Daniel said, his voice trembling slightly. "I owe it to them and to you to make this right." Emily's gaze shifted toward the living room, where Jack and Liam were playing with a set of toy trains. She sighed, her shoulders relaxing just a bit. "This isn't going to be easy," she said, her voice quiet. "I know," Daniel replied. "But I'm not going anywhere this time." Back in her suite, Margaret poured herself a glass of wine, staring at the legal papers she had intended to use against Emily. Daniel's defiance had been unexpected, but she wasn't about to back down. "They all think they can win," she murmured to herself, her voice cold and sharp. "But they don't know what I'm capable of." Margaret reached for her phone, dialing a number she rarely used. When the person on the other end picked up, she spoke with quiet authority. "I need a favor." Discreet but decisive. "The Porters won't know what hit them." Emily stood at the playground, watching Jack and Liam chase each other around the jungle gym. Their laughter carried through the crisp autumn air, but her mind was far from the moment. Margaret's looming threat lingered in her thoughts, an ever-present shadow. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands shoved into his pockets, as he watched the boys with a mixture of awe and regret. He had spent the past few days trying to rebuild bridges, showing up for Jack and Liam in ways he hadn't before. But Emily knew this wasn't just about him anymore, it was about Margaret. "You really think you can stop her?" Emily asked quietly, not looking at him. Daniel sighed. "I don't know, but I'm going to try." Emily turned to face him, her gaze sharp. "Trying won't be enough, Daniel. Margaret doesn't fight fair. She's already shown that." Daniel hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. "I'm working on it," he said finally. Before Emily could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It was her landlord. Stepping away, she answered the call. "Emily," the landlord said, his tone apologetic but firm. "I've got bad news. Someone bought the building paid well over market value. They're planning to renovate. I'm sorry, but you've got 30 days to move." Emily's heart sank. 30 days? "I can't, I'm sorry," he repeated, cutting her off. "I tried to push back, but there's nothing I can do." The call ended, leaving Emily stunned. When she turned back, Daniel had approached, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's wrong?" he asked. Emily swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "The building's been sold. We're being evicted." Daniel's face darkened. "Margaret." That evening, Andrew arrived at Emily's apartment, finding her sitting at the kitchen table, papers and a notepad spread out in front of her. "She's trying to squeeze me out," Emily said, her voice edged with frustration. "First the custody threat, now this. She's trying to make it impossible for me to stay." Andrew sat down across from her, his expression calm but determined. "So what's the plan?" Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know. I barely make enough to cover rent here. Finding something affordable in 30 days," her voice trailed off. "You're not alone in this," Andrew said gently. "We'll figure it out together." Emily looked at him, her eyes softening. She wanted to believe him, to trust that things would work out. But Margaret's power felt insurmountable, a wall she couldn't climb. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. His mother had always been relentless, but this time, her actions felt more personal. She wasn't just targeting Emily. She was targeting him too. His finger hovered over the screen before he finally made the call. "Victoria," he said when his ex-wife picked up. There was a pause on the other end before Victoria responded, her voice cold. "Why are you calling me, Daniel?" "I need your help," he admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. "It's about my mother." Victoria laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Your mother? You mean the woman who tried to control every aspect of my life? Why would I help you?" "Because she's going after my sons," Daniel said, his voice tight. "She's trying to take them from their mother. I can't stop her alone." There was silence, and then Victoria sighed. "You've got nerve, Daniel. But if this is about stopping Margaret, I'll listen." The next morning, Emily received a knock on her door. When she opened it, Victoria stood on the other side, impeccably dressed and radiating confidence. "Victoria?" Emily asked, shocked. "I'm here to help," Victoria said simply. "And to make sure Margaret doesn't destroy your life the way she tried to destroy mine." Emily stepped aside, letting her in. Andrew and Daniel, already in the apartment, exchanged surprised glances. Victoria set her bag on the table and looked directly at Emily. "If we're going to fight Margaret, we need to play her game and we need to play it better." Emily sat across from Victoria at the small kitchen table, her mind racing. Victoria's arrival felt like an unexpected lifeline, but it also stirred unease. What did she stand to gain from helping, and could she be trusted? Andrew leaned against the counter, arms crossed as he observed the interaction, with quiet caution. Daniel sat nearby, visibly uncomfortable in the presence of his ex-wife. Victoria broke the silence, her tone brisk. "First, let's be clear. I'm not doing this for you, Daniel, or for some sense of justice. I'm here because Margaret has always played dirty, and someone needs to beat her at her own game." Emily nodded slowly. "And how do we do that?" Victoria's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "By exposing her. Margaret thrives on control and appearances. If we take those away, she loses her power." Victoria pulled a slim folder from her designer bag and placed it on the table. "I've kept records. Everything she did to me during our marriage, manipulations, lies, even financial discrepancies. If she's pulling strings to sabotage your life, it won't be hard to find a pattern." Emily hesitated, her fingers grazing the folder. "And if we don't find anything?" Victoria leaned back, her gaze sharp. "We will, but we'll need leverage. That's where Daniel comes in." Daniel straightened, his expression wary. "What do you mean?" "You're her weak spot," Victoria said plainly. "You've always been the golden child, the one she groomed to carry on the Lexington name. If you openly side against her, it'll damage her reputation publicly and within her circle of influence." Daniel's jaw tightened. "She'll retaliate." "Of course she will," Victoria replied coolly. "But this time, she won't be able to hide behind the Lexington legacy. Not if we expose what she's been doing to Emily and the boys." Emily exchanged a glance with Andrew, her unease growing. "This is risky. Margaret doesn't just lose, she destroys anyone in her way." Victoria nodded, her expression firm. "Which is why we hit her hard and fast. I have contacts in the media who'd love a story about a powerful matriarch abusing her influence. And we have you, Emily, a mother fighting to protect her children. That's a narrative Margaret can't spin in her favor." Later that evening, Daniel and Victoria met in private to discuss the next steps. The tension between them was palpable, years of unresolved bitterness hanging in the air. "Why are you really here?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "Because I know what it's like to be caught in her web. And because I refuse to let her do to those boys what she tried to do to our daughter." Daniel's expression softened, guilt flickering across his face. "I failed Haley. I let Margaret push me into a life I didn't want, and I ruined us in the process." Victoria sighed, her voice tinged with sadness. "You didn't just ruin us, Daniel. You let her ruin you." But if you're serious about fighting back, maybe you can finally do some good for those boys, for Emily, and maybe even for yourself. The next day, Emily received an eviction notice in the mail. Her stomach churned as she read the official letter, the deadline to vacate looming just weeks away. "This is her," Emily muttered, clutching the paper tightly. "Margaret's behind this." Andrew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out. You're not alone in this anymore." Victoria, seated at the table with her laptop, looked up. "Good. The more she pushes, the more ammunition we have. I've already reached out to my contact at the Chronicle. If we can connect her actions here to a pattern of abuse, we'll have a story she can't bury." Emily nodded, determination hardening in her chest. She looked at her sons, who were playing quietly in the living room. For them, she'd face anything. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her New York office, reviewing the latest developments. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she read the report from her property acquisition team. "Emily's running out of options," she murmured to herself. But her confidence wavered as her assistant entered with a hesitant expression. "Ma'am, we've received inquiries from the Chronicle about the family's financial dealings. They're asking about property purchases and the custody petition." Margaret's smile faltered. "Who's behind it?" "We don't know yet," the assistant replied. "But it's gaining traction." Margaret's jaw tightened. She had spent a lifetime mastering control, but for the first time, she felt the edges of her carefully constructed world begin to fray. Margaret Lexington paced her New York office, her typically steely composure showing cracks as the latest updates from her assistant replayed in her mind. The Chronicle was sniffing around her dealings, her carefully orchestrated moves to corner Emily unraveling faster than she had anticipated. The chessboard she had meticulously arranged now seemed stacked against her. "Call our legal team," she said sharply, "and find out who's feeding them information. I want names." Her assistant nodded and hurried out, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. She walked to the window, staring at the city skyline. For decades, the Lexington name had been a symbol of power and prestige, untouchable in its legacy. But now, with Daniel defying her and Victoria digging into her secrets, the foundation was cracking. "This isn't over," Margaret whispered to herself. "Not by a long shot." Back in Chicago, Emily and Victoria sat in the cafe, the air buzzing with tension. Victoria scrolled through her laptop, her polished nails tapping the keys as she compiled the evidence she had gathered against Margaret. "Here," Victoria said, turning the screen toward Emily. "This is what we have so far. Property records, eviction notices, and a few discrepancies in Margaret's financial dealings. If we package this correctly, it's enough to show a pattern of abuse and manipulation." Emily leaned in, scanning the screen. "This might work, but what if she finds a way to spin it? She always has a way of coming out clean." Victoria smirked. "Not this time. The media loves a scandal, and I've made sure this will look like a case of the powerful preying on the vulnerable. Public sympathy will be on your side." Daniel entered the cafe, his shoulders stiff with tension. He slid into the seat beside them, a stack of papers in hand. "I've been going through my mother's accounts. She's hiding more than we thought." He placed the papers on the table, his voice low. "Offshore accounts, payments to investigators, even a few bribes to keep certain indiscretions quiet. If we leak this, it'll destroy her credibility." Emily frowned. "Do you think this will be enough to stop her?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It has to be." Later that evening, Margaret's assistant delivered another troubling update. "Ma'am, the media inquiries are escalating. They've contacted your office directly. And I believe your son is involved." Margaret's stomach turned, but her face remained calm. "Of course he is," she said icily. "Daniel always had a weak spine, and now he's letting his guilt drive him to ruin." The assistant hesitated. "And there's more. Emily's received public support from Victoria. She's been feeding the press as well." Margaret froze. Victoria had always been a thorn in her side, but this level of betrayal was unexpected. Enough, Margaret snapped. Schedule a press conference. I'll take control of the narrative before they can. The next day, Emily received a call from the Chronicle. The journalist on the other end was eager to speak with her about her story, a single mother facing off against one of the most powerful families in the country. Emily hesitated, glancing at Daniel and Victoria, who were seated across the room. You should do it, Victoria said firmly. Your voice will shift public opinion. Margaret thrives on silence. You're breaking that. Daniel nodded. She can't manipulate you if the whole world is watching. Emily took a deep breath. Okay, let's do it. The story broke the following morning, splashed across major headlines. It painted a picture of Margaret as a ruthless matriarch, willing to trample anyone in her way. Emily's heartfelt interview struck a chord with readers, especially as she described the lengths she had gone to protect her sons from the Lexington named Shadow. Margaret's press conference later that day was a disaster. Reporters bombarded her with questions about her financial dealings and manipulations, questions she struggled to deflect. The carefully curated image of the Lexington family began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. As Margaret left the podium, her expression was grim. She had underestimated them all, Emily, Victoria, and even Daniel. That evening, Daniel met Margaret in her New York office. She stood by the window, her back to him, the weight of defeat visible in the slump of her shoulders. Was it worth it? Daniel asked quietly. Margaret didn't turn to face him. Everything I've done for this family. No, Daniel said, his voice firm. You did it for yourself. And look where it got you. Margaret turned, her eyes sharp. Don't lecture me. You're no saint, Daniel. You let me control you because it was easier than standing up for what you wanted. He flinched, but held his ground. You're right. I let you push me around for years. But not anymore. I'm going to make things right with Emily, with my sons. And there's nothing you can do to stop me. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, she realized she had lost control not just of Daniel, but of everything. Andrew placed a hand on Emily's, his voice warm. You can finally breathe. Across the city, Margaret sat alone in the now empty Lexington mansion, the once grand halls eerily silent. Her portrait still hung prominently in the foyer, but she couldn't bear to look at it. She had fought for control, for power, for legacy, but in doing so, she had driven away everyone she claimed to love. The sound of the front door creaking open startled her. She turned to find Daniel standing there, his expression unreadable. I thought you might show up, Margaret said, her voice quiet. Daniel stepped into the room, his hands in his pockets. I came to say goodbye. Margaret's lips tightened. You're walking away? Just like that? No, Mother, Daniel said, his tone steady. I'm walking toward something better. You taught me how to fight, but it's Emily who showed me what's worth fighting for. Margaret's shoulders sagged as she lowered her gaze. And the boys? Will I ever see them? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. That's not my decision to make anymore. If Emily decides one day to let you into their lives, it'll be her choice, not yours, not mine. Margaret nodded. Slowly, the weight of regret settling over her like a heavy cloak. Then I suppose this is the end. Daniel turned to leave, pausing at the door. It doesn't have to be, he said softly, then stepped into the fading sunlight. Back at the cafe, Emily's boys tugged at her sleeve. Can we go to the park, Mom? Jack asked, his eyes bright with excitement. Emily smiled, brushing her hand through his hair. Sure, sweetheart. As the group walked to the park, Daniel lagged behind, his gaze drifting to Emily and the boys. Andrew caught his hesitation and leaned in. You've got a lot of work ahead if you want to earn their trust, Andrew said, his voice neutral but not unkind. Daniel nodded. I know. I'll take it one step at a time. Andrew extended a hand. For what it's worth, I'm rooting for you. They deserve to have both of us in their corner. Daniel hesitated, then shook Andrew's hand, a tentative truce forming between them. At the park, Jack and Liam raced toward the swings, their laughter filling the crisp air. Emily and Victoria sat on a bench nearby, watching the boys with quiet pride. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for," Victoria said, breaking the silence. Emily chuckled softly. "I had no choice. They're my world." Victoria nodded, her gaze distant. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're the one raising them. Margaret would have turned them into pawns, just like she tried to do with Haley." Emily placed a hand on Victoria's. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Victoria smiled faintly. "I think you could have, but I'm glad I could help." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, Emily watched her boys play with Daniel nearby. They were laughing as he pushed them on the swings, their joy infectious. Andrew sat beside her, his hand finding hers. "You okay?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." She glanced at Daniel, who looked up and met her gaze. There was no bitterness there, only a shared understanding of fragile peace that might one day grow into something more. For now, the storm had passed. And as Emily looked at the family she had built, the scars of the past felt less sharp, replaced by a quiet, steadfast hope for the future. As the sun set on Emily's hard-fought journey, her story reminded us all of the power of resilience, love, and the strength to stand up for what truly matters. It's a story of breaking free from the chains of the past and building a brighter future for the ones we cherish most. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt and inspiring tales. Join our community of storytellers, and let's keep creating a space where stories like Emily's can remind us of the strength we all carry within. Stay tuned for more incredible stories coming your way soon. Together, let's continue to share, inspire, and grow. See you in the next story.